Is there any evidence that African black people are in the midst of a cultural identity crisis? We're going to look at the evidence today. One of the most critical places where we find evidence of the cultural identity crisis is by what we call ourselves, or what we have been called by others, that has created the confusion. And so the Africans in the United States, for example, and the Africans in the Caribbean, in South America, and on the continent of Africa feel, for the most part, that they are not related. So you will hear the Africans in the United States saying, oh, those Jamaicans or those Haitians. And you will hear the Jamaicans saying, oh, those Americans or African Americans. And all of them saying, oh, those Africans. And they speak as if they are not related or connected. Yes, they're all different cultures, but there's a strand, a strain that runs through all of us that connects all of us. And so the confusion began when Africans were taken from the continent, our people were taken from the continent. And by continent, I'm referring to the African continent, and brought into the Western world hemisphere, particularly brought into the Caribbean, where African people who were kidnapped and brought here were made into slaves. There was a process that had to take place, and I'll have to go into that much later, that made these people into slaves, because there were no slaves that were picked up in Africa and brought to the United States. There were people of different ethnic groups, African ethnic groups, that were brought into this Western hemisphere and then made into a slave, or made into slaves. And once we understand something about who Africans were or what we were doing, we'll understand what that means. But that's another lesson. And so we were brought here, and the Europeans encountering us did not acknowledge who we were as ethnic groups, whether we were Igbo, Ewe, Ashanti. They just called us colored because it distinguished us from them in some fashion in their minds. Okay, because I, as a black African person, I would not look at an Indian person and say that's a colored person. And nor will an Indian look at a Chinese or a Japanese person and say that's a colored person. The person who says that's a colored person is a person who assumes that they have no color, which we identify, and they identify themselves as white skin. And so they called us colored, dislocating us from our geographical location, our heritage, our culture, and our land. So colored, that's where the dislocation begins to start. Then we move to Negro, or they move to Negro, a Spanish term for black. But what most people don't know is that this word for black has its root in Greek. All English words have their origins in Indo-European languages, or Indo-European languages, or Greco-Latin languages. And in the Greek, the word here is negra, which means dead. That's the root of that word, dead. So we were identified as a dead people. There were no Negroes. This was a creation made by whites about us. Then we moved to, they identified us based on what they saw, black people. Black is an adjective that describes a noun: the black shoe, the black car, the black coat, the black sweater. It is identifying the noun. Now, an adjective can be made into a noun which says the blacks, the whites, and so forth. But it is not, it's a description. It is not an indication of who you are or what you are. As we moved forward into history, we see that we decided to begin to call, or they began to call us Afro-Americans, which kind of connected us to the continent, but not fully. It doesn't fully connect us to the continent. But what it represents and evidence is that ever since African people were kidnapped, we have been trying to get back to ourselves. Once we became aware, we've been trying to get back to ourselves. And Afro-American was one of those, because we knew that we were in the Americas. We knew that we weren't European. We knew that we weren't natives of this land in particular, not in all cases. And so we began to identify. Then in the 1980s, I believe it was, we began to identify ourselves as African Americans. And the reason we did that is because we began to realize, really for the first time in a significant way, our connection to the African continent. And we were proud of that. We were glad of that. Now, going back to black just for a minute, to be called black, when I was growing up, and I guess people before that, if you called someone black, in a lot of cases, it was an attempt. It was an insult to be called black. And you're a black person and call another black person, and you perceive that as black, because we were taught that black was a negative. And there's all kinds of discussions about that. You can look up the definitions and see what black is. It's always associated with evil, wicked, bad, devil's food cake versus angel food cake, and so forth. And so we did not want to be identified with that negativity. And so many of our people refused to be called black. They still held on to being called Negroes until the African American appellation came to be in vogue. And we accepted that because we had begun to identify positively with Africa, and we also began to identify positively with black. And one of the pivotal moments is a song by James Brown, "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud." That's when we begin to assert our affirmation of blackness and acceptance of it. But we had to go beyond that because it's still just descriptive. And so African told us who we are, our heritage and our connection. America tells us where we are geographically located on the planet at the time. And so that's why you have that hyphenated word, not only for African Americans, but Chinese Americans, Italian Americans, French Americans, German Americans. Everyone has that because they recognize their identity connected to a land base, which I'm going to get into in the next lesson. They're a land base, but it also told them where they were located geographically on the map at this time. But of course, the one that everyone ran from was Africa. African people do not want to be called African. And so that cultural identity crisis caused us to be separated from that connection to Africa, which is detrimental. But I'll go into that into the next lesson. Let me know what you think in the comments.